Welcome to the Swine Health Black Belt Podcast, the latest in swine health research digested for you. My name's Dr. Clayton Johnson, your host for today's episode, and it is my pleasure to bring into our podcast studios Dr. Mariana Kikuti. Dr. Kikuti, welcome to the show. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me.
Please, I know we have done some nice introductions here, but share with the audience a little bit about yourself. What is your education and what are your experiences within the pig industry?
Yeah, so I graduated in veterinary medicine back in Brazil. I wasn't working with swine at all. I was working mostly with research. And then I went to do both my master's and Ph.D. in public health epidemiology, where I was working with Zika investigations back in Brazil. Then I decided to go back a little bit to my veterinary roots. So I came to the US and joined the MSHIMP group, and where I started working a little bit more with swine and PRRS. So I'm sort of new to the swine industry, about 4 years new, but I'm learning a lot as I go.
I think all of us wish we could go back to the days of Zika, where when we would hear about, pandemic potential, whether it was Zika or SARS or West Nile, right? We would hear about it and a lot of concern, but never kind of the impact that we saw COVID. So probably very interesting for you to watch the last several years here as the globe has dealt with a very serious pandemic. And also very interesting for you to come into the swine industry, where we don't necessarily have a new pandemic, but we have this kind of constant epidemic battle with PRRS virus. Talk to us a little bit, Mariana, about your research with the new novel Lineage 1C PRRS variant.
Yeah, so that issue actually was brought up to us in MSHIMP in late 2020. So the producers and veterinarians started reporting to us that they were seeing this PRRS variant that was affecting mainly their growing finishing herds. And they were telling us that they have very high mortality in those herds. And particularly to me as an epidemiologist, what caught my attention was that they said that the virus that they had was not similar to anything that they have seen before, but they know that their neighbors had a very similar, if not identical, virus. And I've been working with MSHIMP since 2018. And I've been comparing sequences for all of the producers, and it's very rare that we get a 98% identity. So we were getting 100% similarities for those viruses from different production systems. So that to me was very atypical, right? So we reached out to all of the producers and started doing an investigation. With their help, we were able to compare these sequences that they were reporting as problematic to our MSHIMP historical data set, which comprises over 30,000 PRRS sequences from those monitoring, like routine monitoring that the systems have. And then we found, at the time, I think we found like 70 cases in December 2020, which was much more than we were expecting in the beginning. And what was interesting is that most of these sequences or these viruses that were being identified, again, they were very similar to each other. But when we compared to everything else that we had on the data set, even in the public data set like GeneBank or even in the VDL data set, there weren't any sequences that were similar to that particular cluster of sequence of viruses. So that to us, represented that this variant is probably a new variant that was emerging within that viral lineage or PRRS lineage, just because, again, it was so different from everything else that was already going on in the US. So from that, we were actually able to investigate further. So we saw some temporality. We saw that we had a spike of cases around November to December 2020. Then cases went down. Then we had a second spike of cases in the spring of 2021, which was actually much higher than the first one. And we keep monitoring this new variant. And nowadays we still have, I would say, maybe around 10, 15 sites generating sequences from that variant on a weekly basis. We were also able to find out where those cases were occurring. So we knew that I would say maybe 2/3 of the cases were occurring in the growing pig sites. 1/3 was occurring in the sow farms. again, both in the grow finishing sites and in the sow farms, they were reporting high mortality, high pre-weaning mortality, high finishing mortality. So very high impact of those cases. Those cases were occurring mainly in the Iowa and Minnesota region. So even right now, over 90% of all of the cases are still in Iowa and Minnesota. We were able to find out that most of the cases were occurring within about a 70 miles radius. So they were very concentrated in this South Minnesota, Northern Iowa area. We were also able to talk to all of the producers, and we managed to develop a case control study. So we investigated cases that, or herds that were affected with this new variant compared to herds that were affected with other PRRS viruses, to try to find out if there were any particular risk factors that could be associated with the transmission of this variant. And we didn't find anything that was particular to this variant, which means that this variant is being transmitted the same as any other PRRS variant, which is in a sense reconforting, right? Mm-hmm. But we did find that having a market vehicle that was exclusive to the system was yielded a little bit of a higher risk of having that variant. And that makes sense to what we were hearing from the producers and from the systems, that once this variant entered the system, it was very easy for the variant to dissipate within the system. Other than that, because this investigation was done in the early stages of this outbreak, we used just the first wave of transmission, but we were able to do a case control investigation regarding production impact as well. And considering only the first 4 weeks of the outbreak, we found a higher nursery mortality and finishing mortality in cases of this variant compared to cases of other PRRS variants. So again, highlighting the potential higher production impact of this variant, right? So that's pretty much it. We keep monitoring this variant, but it was a very interesting learning experience that I think it was unfortunate, but I think the only reason why we were able to make such a deep epidemiological investigation was also the fact that this variant is so different than one we have seen in the past, which allows us to really make a good case definition.
Yeah. So often what we find scientifically interesting is never good news for the industry, and certainly the case with this specific PRRS variant. But Mariana, as I looked at your research, it's striking to me that in 2020 we saw outbreaks from October into December, right? You can see the epidemiological curve really behave not terribly indifferent from what you would expect. We have an outbreak, it kind of goes up in a season where we expect a lot of PRRS. October to December, no surprise, we get some PRRS there. But then it went quiet. We didn't see it a lot. And then in April, we saw it take off again. Now we see virus move in the spring, but any thoughts from the MSHIP participants or other people you've interviewed as to why we saw that kind of dead space in the middle with not a lot of transmission in a time of year where it's easy to move PRRS around?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think part of the reason could be because most of the cases were occurring in the grow finishing sites, so it could have something to do with the turns, right? Mm-hmm. But also after that initial peak in cases, I think we started having a little bit more cases in the sow farms as well. So I think the transmission kind of went back to the sow farms, and then it could perhaps have gone a little bit undetected in the sow farms until we started really seeing the abortions again.
Well, and that's consistent with all the SDRS reports that demonstrate that our finishing viruses we see this year often become our sow farm viruses next year. So that certainly makes sense. We see a new dominant PRRS strain in our industry roughly every 3 years, whether it's 174 or now 144. We have horrible ways of naming it, but we see a new dominant virus blow through the industry. Do you see any reason at this point to think that we have a different forecast than we've had in the past, right? Are we going to see this virus be dominant in the industry for the next 2 to 3 years? Then we are on to something new again? Or do you think there is a staying power with this virus that's unique and epidemiologically it will remain relevant longer than the ancestor viruses that have been the dominant virus for a 3-year period?
So again, this case is a very particular case in the sense that because it's so different from what we had in the past, we are able to track it a little bit better. I don't think that was the case for previous dominant strains, right? We only know that they are dominant once they are already dominant, right? And
Sure.
here we were able to kind of see that increase in cases occurring. The interesting thing here for this variant is that, again, if we look at the cases nowadays, it's still heavily concentrated in Minnesota and Iowa. So we don't see that spreading too much outside this region. Why? I can't really explain why, but I think, one possibility is that perhaps that is the case for many of the dominant variants, but we are just not able to see that. And maybe in a couple of years, we're going to see this new variant actually dominating the swine industry. So again, it's a learning opportunity here for us, right? I can't say for sure, but right now it is still very concentrated in the Midwest region.
Yeah. From my perspective, Mariana, the next year will be very telling because the reality is this virus has not really jumped across the Mississippi River and moved to the Eastern Corn Belt. It didn't start in North Carolina. So, if it's the new viruses that start in North Carolina, they're coming to the Midwest because the pigs come to the Midwest. The viruses that start in Minnesota and Iowa, they don't have to move into the Eastern Corn Belt because the pigs never really cross the Mississippi River. So I think if our biosecurity, where I live in Illinois and in Indiana, if that biosecurity can prevent the virus from coming into our systems, I think we have a chance of minimizing the overall impact on the industry. But if we get this into sow farms in Illinois and in Indiana, Michigan, Ohio, we're, I think, going to see similar levels of outbreaks in future years to what Minnesota and Iowa have seen so far with this virus.
Yeah, I agree. And I would say also that the longer it takes, perhaps the milder the cases will be because the virus is adapting more and more to the pigs. So perhaps, the production impact will be lower every time, the more time passes, right, for that to occur.
Absolutely. And we're building herd immunity at some level as well, right? Kind of like our COVID discussion, right? Is COVID becoming less virulent with time? Are we building herd immunity and that's resulting in less expression of disease? The reality is probably some of both. And from a producer standpoint, either way, we'll take it, right? Anything that decreases the mortality impact, the negative welfare impact on the pigs, we're all for.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
Very good. Well, thank you very much, Mariana, for coming on the podcast. It's been my pleasure to chat with you about this. And to the audience, thank you very much for participating. If you have not visited our website, please go check out swinehealthblackbelt.com. Make sure to subscribe and keep up with us as we post weekly podcasts on the latest and greatest swine health research, which we digest and trying to put into a very easily digestible format for you, the audience. For Dr. Mariana Kikuti, my name is Clayton Johnson, and this has been the Swine Health Black Belt Podcast. Thanks, and have a great rest of your week.
Hey, everyone. We're always searching for the latest and greatest research to share each week. If you have a swine health-related research trial and would like to come on the show to talk about it with me and share it with our audience, feel free to send an email to healthblackbelt@swineit.com, and we would love to take a look at your research.